I mean, the other thing I haven't quite said is I was going to. Okay.
Wait. Tell everybody what that rave culture thing meant, because I remember that ruling. There was a reason why they changed the regulation. What was that for?
It was what it was really for is the government. John Major was the successor to Margaret Thatcher. I mean, we now look back on John Major and we think he was a benign, fairly liberal human being, because Thatcher was radical and was divisive and individualistic, and there was racist and homophobic legislation passed by that government. There was an economic war and there was a cultural war. John Major was much less divisive, but he was a very grey figure. He didn't have a strong personality. He didn't have the strength of vision of Margaret Thatcher. People were sort of relieved, but also people were kind of fed up that the Conservatives were still in power. So in order to try and popularise his administration, which wasn't that losing ground opinion polls, he passed this thing called the Criminal Justice Act that tried to kind of group together a bunch of marginal groups in society and target them in order to kind of show how he was a strong leader, and he was going to put in place these, if you like, rebellious countercultural groups. So it included hunt saboteurs, roads protesters, I think I can't remember some activist groups, and also ravers.
Right.
It was a hodgepodge of a bill trying to pick on these outcast groups in society.
That's exactly.
And there was this been a very banal definition of rave culture about that was organised about it being music that foregrounded repetitive beats, as if that's a problem, even if there are, there's not. Repetition and variation are one of the kind of most extraordinary things in all music, not just in rave music. So anyway, it was passed, and it was quite for a few years definitely there was a fairly significant reduction in rave culture, and a lot of the energy moved back into the clubs. But one of the reasons why rave had exploded in the first place was because of the licensing restrictions on nightclubs. Right. They were all it was like the old New York laws. I mean, I can't quite remember when they changed in New York City. I hadn't got that far in my history. But in the 1970s, they generally had to close at 3:30 in the morning, I think, as far as I can remember. And it was similar in the UK. And of course, if you're going out and you're starting a dance at 11 o'clock or midnight, then that's just not long enough. And if someone has taken a substance, whether it's ecstasy or who knows what, they want it to carry on. So raves, because they were in this kind of semi-legally grey space, were able to carry on until the early hours. It's exactly the same as someone like David Mancuso.
Well, that's why he created membership.
Yeah, he wanted to avoid. I mean, he had many reasons for wanting to put on a party in his home, but one of the most important was the fact that he didn't want New York's cabaret licensing laws to tell him when he was going to stop the party. And he didn't want them telling him that he had to sell alcohol, because he wasn't interested in selling. He wasn't interested in making money that way. And he didn't think that alcohol helped the dance floor. He thought it was a detriment to the dance floor. So anyway, rave had there was something about the freedom of rave that, I loved, and that resonated with me, and that I would sort of rediscover, I suppose, when I would eventually meet David. But the one thing I wanted to briefly mention is that I was going to the gardening club. It was like a lifeline for me, actually. In this moment of some sense of desolation and isolation, it was on that dance floor that I felt that things were actually okay. Because for a lot of the rest of the time in my life, at that period, I didn't feel they were okay. But on the dance floor, with this collective of DJs playing this house music that largely came from New York, surrounded by people who were dancing and were generally smiling and being friendly, I felt everything was okay with the world. I would then go back, many hours later, and things would seem a bit less okay. So, but something was happening on that dance floor that was, the Hacienda was a one-off experience, and it was just extraordinary, and there was an immediate connection. But this was like, this is providing me with a sense of community, and if you like spirituality, or a sense of meaning and a place in the world that is profound, and it wasn't that long after I was started to dance at the gardening club. A guest DJ came in to do a 2-hour set. I guess this guest DJ might have played a few nights that night in London, and he was kind of doing a little tour, and it was Louis Vega. And I still remember a whole bunch of records that Louis played that night. South Street Player, Do You Believe? She keeps changing her mind, or She Keeps Changing Her Mind. South Street Player, and The Believers, Roy Ayers, Do You Believe in Me? And I was like, wow, it was just like I remember being on that floor and just like crying basically at the sheer beauty and of the music, the atmosphere. And I was already buying quite a lot of Louis records. Deep Inside by Hard Drive, the dub version was just like, it was a big record in that part. That was very much the vibe of that party. It was warm, it was dubby, it was groovy. It felt very alternative, but also it wasn't like on its own trip. It was like the music was constantly kind of connecting with people. So I wanted to, I've kind of maybe said this, I don't know if I've said this in a very convincing way, but a big part of me going to want to live in New York was wanting to be able to go and dance to Louis' selections at the Sound Factory bar every Wednesday night, because that's where he was playing at the time. And this was my idea: do a doctorate, English literature, reconnect through literature with, my losses, but also my dad, who had become an English teacher, and my mum also loved literature, and go dancing every night. The sound Willie Ninja was working the door at that particular point. Barbara Tucker was the co-host. Musicians, such as Tito Puente, were performing regularly at the Sound Factory bar. It was nuts. I do remember some people weren't that happy with the new digital sound system that had been recently installed in the party. But I just thought it was extraordinary, actually, and it was a total privilege to be able to go there. So I moved to New York in 1994.
Okay.
And in the autumn of 1994. And just to sort of finish this, the musical influences bit of the question. Sorry, this is a long.
No, you have to explain. You have to explain.
I had a very kindly professor, a young professor at the time. We've all aged a bit since then, of course. A guy called Rob Nixon, who was also similarly minded. He'd done his research, he was writing good books, but he was always kind of looking out, and he was doing journalism and all sorts of things that was kind of engaging with a kind of wider general public, if you want to call it that. And he turned to me and he said, "Why don't you write a quick book?" In inverted commas, this is as a direct quote. "Why don't you write a quick book about the history of rave culture, or house music culture and rave culture?" Because it was a big story. It had just been criminalized in the UK. And I thought, great, I'm going to do that. And I put together a proposal. If I reread that proposal now, it would be kind of slightly laughable in terms of what I ended up doing. It was, things quickly moved on in terms of the way that I wanted to do writing. But that was the key moment. Someone saying, "Why don't you do a quick book about this?" And I wrote a proposal. It was an incredible. The place I most wanted to publish was Duke University Press. It's a university press, so university press books don't always circulate very easily. They don't get reviewed in the mainstream newspapers, the New York Times, wherever. But this editor had an incredible reputation, and Duke University produced beautiful books that you just wanted to hold, and they were very nicely produced. The graphics, everything that the paper was printed on, and that was where I really wanted to publish. And the editor, it turned out, who's a kind of a Renaissance man figure, a guy called Ken Wissaker, who just has extraordinary cultural and political knowledge about you name it. He kind of covers it, and he's a truly extraordinary editor. And he wanted to, as it happens, because he's a super cool dude, he already wanted to publish a book about house music, and he was actually a DJ, a hip hop DJ in Chicago, who also was into house music in the mid 1980s. Where I think he might have been doing his doctorate. So he was very clued into the music. And he had actually rejected a book that had come out, I think, in 1999 by Sarah Thornton called Club Cultures, which is one of the early books about clubbing. But that book was a very kind of analytical, quite theoretical book. It was bringing theories of a French philosopher called Pierre Bourdieu. And it was like, if you were into the culture and you read this book, you think, what the hell is going on here? This book is not, and it was like, it was emotionally removed. It didn't engage with the culture on its own terms. It didn't speak to people involved in the scene. It was quite sort of sniffy, superior. And he had been offered that book and had actually rejected it, interestingly. But he knew he wanted a book about dance music. And I sent him my proposal. My proposal, I would say, was a good proposal, but it was trying to be quite like manifesto-like, saying that rave culture could transform the world in all these ways, and it would do this. You know, there was elements of what we call cultural theory in there, and it was interesting because you know, he basically, Ken's response was say, "I want this book, but you know, I think the really important thing for this book is, you know, you don't go down the route of what Sarah Thornton has done. It's, you know, what people want. You know, it's got to be about the culture." And by the time I got this response from Ken, I had already, and what are called peer review, the readers, the peer review readers who will say whether they think the book should be commissioned or not. That's the university press research process. I had started to conduct research for this book.
Well, that's what I want to know. Who helps you gain this research? And you're living in New York.
Yeah. Well, I was already going to Dance Tracks, this store on East 3rd Street, run by Stefan Prescott and Joe Clisell, of course. And I was going there every Friday night, and it was a scene down there, really. I think Friday night was the night the imports came in, maybe. So that was the night that everyone. It was quite funny because I'd come from Europe, London, because I was so into New York music, basically, and Chicago, but I was into US, but it's kind of large. I was mainly into the New York stuff, to be fair, by that particular moment. But in New York, everyone's like waiting for the imports to come in from Europe and London. It's all, you know, we romanticize the other sometimes, don't we, in these situations? So that was kind of music. But anyway, I was going down there, and I was getting to know, you know, lots of people, and I was still dancing, you know. I think at some point, Sound Factory Bar closed down and Body and Soul started. So everything was in the air. I was getting to know Joe. I was becoming friendly with Stefan, and yeah, I was just sort of. I was also, the other thing is I'd come from journalism. So I was quite used to knowing about how to approach people with an idea and persuade them to talk to me, because that's what I'd been to journalism school, and I'd been trained to do this. And I was quite bold, you know, as a young man. I didn't have too many fears. So I was approaching people very, very early on, because I was supposed to be writing a history of house music, and I was into house music. And I will confess, I've never been ashamed to confess, I was not interested in writing about disco. To me, as I've already said, disco was kind of the music that I was listening to as a 10-year-old on the radio. And I identified it with a bunch of well-known acts, some of whom are very credible. But, you know, whether it's Donna Summer or the Bee Gees or Chic, you know, we might want to say, well, we like some Donna Summer and we think Chic are great and we're not so sure about the Bee Gees. I don't know. Everyone will have their own take, but I wasn't sure I wanted to go there. And at times, I even remember Stefan in particular, but also Joe, were trying to sell me disco classics. My ears, I've got quite large ears, that they were electronic. I was addicted to house music, and I couldn't hear much else. When New Eureka Soul album came out in 1997, it was a bit of a shock to my system. This was when Louis and Kenny basically decided to re-record a bunch of classics from, you know, primarily the 1970s, and to bring, you know, figures like Jocelyn Brown and a whole bunch of, you know, Vince Montana and others to record them. And it was all live. Jocelyn Brown's It's All Right, I Feel It was the big kind of hit, the big body and soul hit from the album. It was a great record, but, you know, that was a turning point for me, actually. That was like about the beginning of a tuning to like live instrumentation. And of course, Spiritual Life was prolific at this point. And also Louis and Kenny before then, they had already been bringing instrumentalists into house music. but I hadn't quite got to the point where I wanted to have a live drums instead of to me, the electronic drums were the things that propelled everything in a way that couldn't be my ears. I have to say, my ears have since changed.
No, that's what happens. That's what happens. You get cultivated, and then you start to see the response of these records being played, and it becomes like, maybe I'm missing something. Maybe I need to explore this a bit more. You start to think, maybe I need to explore my mind a little more, open up.
Exactly.
I'm still waiting to find out how.
Yeah. So let me just say, so I was just going to just like slowly again. So I was supposed to be writing about house music, and Stefan knew this. And Stefan said, well, I know you're doing this, but why don't you speak to this guy, David Mancuso? He was around sometime at the beginning. I don't know. Oh, David. Hi, David. That's one of my favorite David photos. It was taken, I think, in 1975 by Peter Hujar, who was a very significant and quite important, influential gay photographer who I believe died from AIDS. So that Peter took this photo. Which is how
did they get you to Mancuso? I want to hear this.
Well, Stefan knew David. I think David was going. David didn't really go into record stores at this. I think as a younger man he did, but he had stopped going into record stores. As everyone now knows, but not that many people knew for a while. He was running the New York record pool. He was getting more records coming to him through the record pool than he could listen to. This was the case with all DJs at one point. The kind of the market, if you want to call it that, did become a bit flooded in the latter part of the 1970s. Disco did become did become highly commercialized, and some DJs, what fantastic photo.
I took these photos from his mom.
So David co-founded the. I mean, this was anyway. We may come back to some of this stuff, but there was anyway. Stefan said, "Why don't you speak with David?" He was around sometime at the beginning. I didn't really want to go there, but I was also a reasonably polite young man, and I was quite inquisitive as well. And I trusted Stefan actually, and I really wanted to explore things, and I had a sense that I might need a bit of a backdrop story, if you like, to house music. But I didn't know. I have to say, I didn't know much about David, and I tried to do some research. And this was, by the way, like the spring of 1997. So none of these, not even the Sarah Thornton book, had come out. Last Night a DJ didn't come out for a few years. There wasn't much written about. A few books had started to come out about the kind of rave scene in the UK, and I think one of them maybe gave a fleeting reference, like a one-sentence reference to David, before going on to write a paragraph about the Paradise Garage, before then going into the story of the warehouse, and then really carrying on the story in the UK. A lot of these early UK histories were really all about the UK, but there was a page or two about the United States. So it was very hard to find much out about David. There was another guy who I prefer not to name because it's, I don't want to kind of try and undermine what he said, but he was finishing a doctorate in house music, actually at Columbia University. And he told me, don't bother interviewing David Mancuso. It'll be a waste. It'll basically be a bit of a waste of time. His parties are not really running anymore. He doesn't mix records. He doesn't particularly like house music. His sound system is antiquated, uses like this kind of high-end stereo that you never find in clubs anymore. And, it's not really relevant to house music culture. We are, of course, on a program that is all about kind of, house. So here we are, where this is David Mancuso relevant to us or not? And, it was interesting. So I was warned not to waste my time, but I went to meet David. Anyway, and it was another one of these transformative experiences. I mean, immediately I liked the guy. I was drawn to him. He was he came across as go on.
Ask this question. Just you hearing all the negatives, no sound, this and this and this, must have made you, as the journalist with your hat on, go, now I must have to meet this man. Think about that.
I was intrigued, but I was also a little bit worried, because I think by this point I'd already arranged to meet David, basically. I think if I hadn't already arranged to meet David, I would have probably been influenced by this guy. if I'm to be honest, I might not have gone ahead with that interview, but I had gone ahead and contacted David, and he had said, yes, let's meet. And I'm one of these people, if you kind of make a plan, if I make an arrangement, it kills me to break that arrangement. I'd feel terrible. I don't like it. So I basically went ahead with it. I was interested with meeting someone who would have perspective. That's for sure. That would have, even if I'm told this guy's not really relevant. And also it's about trusting Stefan as well, and trusting the guy, and Joe and the guy, the Dance Tracks community, if you like, that these were, they were not going to suggest I speak to him for nothing. He'd clearly been around. But what I suppose I'm partly trying to say is that he had sort of disappeared a bit from history. His party had he'd had some unfortunate decisions. The decision to move from Prince Street to 3rd Street, which took place in basically in the second half of 1984, did not work out as David had hoped. He thought he was moving into the place that would become a permanent home for the Loft. Alphabet City had been promised regeneration money by Jimmy Carter. David went and moved there on the basis that it could be regenerated in the way that Soho had come from being an abandoned kind of part of downtown New York to this flourishing part of New York. David liked Soho, but he didn't like the fact there was no community in Soho. And he didn't really think the artists were very communally minded. They tried to stop him from opening on Prince Street, apart from anything else. And he thought that a bunch of them were primarily kind of, more driven by real estate investment than by art. And he wanted to get back to the community vibes of the East Village. That was what he considered to be home. But Ronald Reagan got elected in November 1980. He took office in, early in 1981. And his first budgets started to cut the money that had been promised for regeneration. And by the time David moved there in 1984, the money had been whipped away that was promised had been taken away from the area. It was a war zone. It was a drug war zone. And David lost 2/3 of his crowd overnight. And many of the women just didn't want to go to that part of town. They felt it was too dangerous. David then got caught up in other things, including, a business relationship with a lawyer who ended up kind of taking his building away from him. And it was a downward spiral for David in some respects between 1984 and 1987 when I met him. It was in some ways, it was the lowest ebb he had ever been with his parties, you could say. But he was also looking to get going again. He had just opened a space on Avenue B. It didn't work out. But he was all, the thing about David is that he's got this, his favorite book was written by a guy called John Diamond, called The Life Energy of Music. David is very interested in the way that, music gives you a life energy. What kind of music gives you a life energy? And there's a life energy in David. He was a strong, resilient person with just an extraordinary spirit. And I think that a lot of people who came into contact with him, although, he had fallings out and there were arguments, and he didn't, he may have made some decisions during this period that he would regret. But he had a spirit and a will and an inner core of a vision about what he wanted to achieve that never really, he never abandoned that. Even at his lowest ebb, he was holding on to certain ways that he wanted the party to be. I had people coming up to him, we're jumping a bit ahead here, but I'll finish this story and then try and rewind. But people were coming up to me, I won't name names, sort of saying, look, I think that I want to help David, and if I can do this with him, and if he comes in and we do this kind of deal, and this is how it will work, and this will be the system, and this will be the space, and this will be how we cut the deal. And David was always like, no. He would rather not do something that he considered in his terms to be a compromise than to do it and start to get, let's say, a decent income again. Because he was absolutely focused on he had a real inner belief in what a certain type of party set up in a certain type of way could produce in terms of energy and spirit and community and, a revitalization in your life. So, but anyway, going back to when I first met David, he was I think I just, in the intro to Love Saves the Day, I might describe him as a cross between a teddy bear and a biblical prophet. That was something, what he was like. He's quite a big guy, kind of, when he was younger, he looked like Jesus. Now I guess he looked like a kind of rather aging and bedraggled Jesus who didn't have a particularly good diet, but there was still this kind of, it was really interesting. He really wanted to engage. He was passionate. He wanted his story to be told. It became clear very quickly. And it was interesting. We sat down for 3 hours, and I did not really know. I couldn't follow much of the story he was telling. Wow. Now, I hadn't grown up in New York. I hadn't been going out dancing in New York. So clearly, people have been going to the Loft for years, or the Garage. They would know more about David and the Loft than I would. But no one had written this stuff up at this point, and David had fallen out of history. He had only been interviewed at that point maybe 3 times. It's quite extraordinary that was the case, and I really had a sense he liked me, that we got on quite well. And I would later find out that he had one friend in particular when he was younger was a mentor figure, was a writer. He liked writers for some reason. And he related to me as I was a writer, even though this was going to be my first book. But I had done some other writing, I suppose. But he wanted to tell his story, and we sat down for 3 hours, and he came up with there's all this like Michael Capello and Steve D'Aquisto and Francis Grasso and the New York City Record Pool and the 10th Floor and the Gallery. And these were not references that I understood or was familiar with. And I had come from journalism. And so this kind of light bulb kind of started to flash, it was positioned just here behind my head, behind my right ear. And that that imaginary light bulb started to flash. And it said, here's a story that needs to be told. And it's a radical story about not a disco culture actually, but a pre-disco culture that took place, that evolved in downtown, in what was we could probably call the underground. It wasn't a fake underground trying to be cool, but not really underground. This was a genuine radical underground, and it involved a rainbow coalition of dancers who came from disadvantaged backgrounds, whether they be LGBT or whether it be Black or Latin, or whether they be women, but they had been marginalized by society, and they had found communion and spirit and meaning and expressivity on the dance floor. And that culture had mushroomed in a remarkable way, and that had produced disco. And that story had not been told. And
so you sat down with him. Where did you sit down with him? At his?
There was a Italian restaurant in the East Village. It was David's favorite. It was very, very basic. We ate well. David had an appetite for everything: music, food, conversation, ideas.
Did Stefan and Joe go with you to that meeting?
No.
You went by yourself.
And I actually don't know if they were even particularly, I don't think they were friendly with David as such. I think they actually had a bit of difficulty with David, because David, as is reasonably well known, he was very specific about how he wanted lots of things done. And he had a very refined sense of ethics. And some people thought that there were inconsistencies there. I was always interested that even if there might have been some, we all have inconsistencies, let's be honest, to begin with. And I was interested that even if there were inconsistencies, his level of thinking about this culture, I felt, was several paces ahead of pretty much anyone else I'd met. And I'd met some super interesting, super intelligent people who were also immersed in this culture. But David was asking questions and thinking in a way that I found was really compelling. It was supremely intelligent. I thought it was highly advanced. It was daring. And the quarrel he was having with some other people in New York was that this bootleg series was being issued and sold in Dance Tracks called Loft Classics.
Yes, I know.
And David had nothing to do with it. And he didn't get any money from it. And he maintained to me, and I'm sure to others, that some of the records that were being released as Loft Classics were not actually records that were getting played at the Loft. So on numerous levels, he felt there was a problem with this, and he was basically trying to get Stefan to stop selling them.
So for him,
David also didn't like bootlegs. He said the artist is not being paid. Now, there's counter arguments to all it. We could discuss this for the next 2 hours, and maybe we don't want to. But I know that I know that some of the guys involved in that have a reply, and the reply is, look, David, these records were not available, and David wasn't doing anything to make them available. So the people who were making these available, even as a bootleg, were doing a form of a public service. I don't know if they had tried, I can't quite remember the details, if they even tried to team up with David, but David had maybe made moves to cooperate, but then had backed out. I forget. It doesn't really, there was the thing is there was sort of a reply. But from the David point of view, I was just interested that he was so resistant to the idea of the bootleg itself. And he felt that someone was taking the Lost name in vain, effectively, without his permission, and that was a kind of trespass.
But that's where I'm going to go with this. So how did he feel? How comfortable did he even feel about you even questioning his background or getting information? Because I knew when I was doing the Legends of the Dance Floor, he didn't want to talk to me at all about Larry Levan. Couldn't get him on the phone. So what was that like for you, dealing with him, to get him to sit at that restaurant? He couldn't stop. He didn't want to stop talking. And by the time I got back to the flat where I was living at the time, there were 5 messages on the answer machine, all from people. This was an hour later, by the way. It probably took me an hour to get back from the East Village to I was living up by Columbia. And there was something like 5. I don't know if something's ringing on my. No, it's just, okay. Go ahead. Don't worry. Okay.
By the time I got back to the flat where I was living that night, there were 5 messages on the answer machine, and they were all from people who David had contacted right away, saying that they wanted to talk with me and would I interview them, basically. And this was like, whoa, this is like,
okay. So
I've got another interesting. It's a related story. I don't often tell this. Don't often tell many of this stuff because. But anyway, up until this point, I had felt like I thought New York was an incredible city, but I didn't feel it. I felt like I wasn't sure. I didn't really think that there was a city that where communities lived. Now, this is partly to do with my blinkered experience of being a student up by Columbia, no doubt, and just assuming and hearing these stories about how New York was a transient place where people would go and live for a few years before moving out to the suburbs where they get the bigger house and the backyard and this. And it was when I met David, really, that I started to appreciate the depth of communities that existed in the city. And that was when a really deep attachment with New York formed. In a sense, it added a dimension to me, and it was partly David. He had lived there. He hadn't lived there all his life. He'd gone to live there as an 18-year-old. He'd grown up in this children's home. So the story was presenting itself to me, and it meant that I had to go not only back to disco but to pre-disco. But it was so fascinating that I thought, yes, I cannot say no. So I'd already lined up. So somehow I'd made some pretty quick moves. I'd already lined up interviews with Frankie Knuckles, Tony Humphries, and David Morales because I was writing a house music history.
Okay.
And I went to do these interviews. They were all great interviews, actually. I have to say. And at some point in all of the interviews, I made a point of asking these guys. So I've met this guy, David Mancuso. He seems to have been around somewhere at the beginning. He seems to have had a really interesting life, and he seems to have been kind of quite according to what he's telling me, quite a pivotal figure. And I just wanted to see if you'd ever heard of him, or if he was, and knew about the Loft. And it was like the 3 replies I got from Frankie and Tony and David was like they were near identical. It was like they were reading from a kind of hymn sheet or something, and they all said, the Loft transformed my experience of the dance floor. It was at the Loft that I understood the potentiality of the dance floor in terms of sound, but also in terms of the social experience. it was the most important thing that ever happened to me. And I was just like, wow, you know, I've bumped into something here, and it was chance in many respects. But I understood that I needed to take this very seriously, because you can always meet people who will exaggerate their importance in terms of what they've contributed to history, you know, and so there was a little bit of me that was wondering whether there was something about David. If anything, David was underestimating his influence, actually. It turned out. So the more I started to explore this story, the more I was blown away by the connections. So David, for example, he didn't particularly tell me that the Paradise Garage was directly inspired by the Loft. But, you know, I interviewed Mel Sharon reasonably early into my research. And I asked him where the idea for the Paradise Garage had come, you know, what is this? And Mel said, well, Michael Brady and I used to go and dance at the Loft every week. And I was like, well, did this have an impact on you? He said, well, yeah, in a way, Michael's idea with the garage was to do an expanded version of the Loft. I had never read this anywhere. No one had told me this. David didn't tell me this, but it's like, oh, you know, at the time, everything was about Frankie Knuckles at the Warehouse and Larry Levan at the Paradise Garage. That was all. You could read countless magazine art. The books hadn't really come out yet, but there was countless magazine. Everyone agreed it was Frankie and Larry. It wasn't David, Nicky, Frankie, Larry, which is kind of a bit more that. But I was like, wow, well, this is, and then, you know, the interview with Frankie was like, Larry and I, we were on the dance floor of the Loft every week. You know, that was where it wasn't just Frankie, it was also Larry. Nicky Siano, I think it was, who probably told me, or maybe it was Francois Kevorkian, that, you know, Larry Levan, especially the opening years at the Paradise Garage, there was a box of Loft records, you know, that, you know, David records, and a box of gallery records, and then there was the rest. So clearly David had. A little later into the research, I was interviewing Robert Williams, who was the founder of the Warehouse in Chicago, because I just felt I wanted to kind of track some of the stories about how the culture was spreading outside of New York. And of course, Disco Sucks was in Chicago. I obviously knew that Chicago was the birthplace of house music, so I wanted to kind of provide the backstory to that in Love Saves the Day. And I was doing this interview with Robert Williams, and I'll say, okay, so can you tell me a bit about your background? Like, how did you come to open the Warehouse? And Robert was like, well, actually, I didn't grow up in New York. I grew up I didn't grow up in Chicago. I grew up in New York. And actually, the key thing that happened to me is that one day I was standing by a bus stop, and a guy came up to me and he said, oh, I like your T-shirt. I can't remember if Robert told me what the T-shirt was, and if I recount this in Love Saves the Day or not. I like your T-shirt. And this guy eventually said to Robert Williams, well, I run a party, you know, Saturday nights. Do you want to come along to one? And Robert went to this party, and this was David Mancuso inviting Robert Williams randomly at a bus stop to the Loft because he liked the look of them, and they had a nice conversation. And Robert Williams started to go to the Loft every week, then moved, for reasons I believe, as far as I can remember, related to work, moved to
Chicago.
And was telling all his friends about how amazing these Loft parties were. And the friend said, look, why don't you start a party? You know, stop talking about it and do one. And that was the Warehouse. And as is well known, Robert asked Larry Levan to be the DJ, but the Paradise Garage was about to open, and Larry was committed to that. So Robert turned to Frankie Knuckles. Even in Chicago, even the Warehouse, his legendary party, the mythological birthplace of house music, if we want to call it that, because house music started in 1984 and the Warehouse closed in, I think, the spring of 1983. So there was a bit of a gap, but without the Warehouse, maybe house music wouldn't have happened indeed, but it wasn't that house music kind of happened at the Warehouse. The house music term did, but that's another story. We don't have to get into that just yet, or maybe not at all. But even at the Warehouse, David's influence was kind of, and then, you know, there was David in this first interview was talking about the New York record pool. I hadn't heard of the New York record pool. I hadn't read about, and most people didn't find that kind of thing particularly interesting because it was about DJs organizing in relationship to record companies. It was like the politics of the sociology of the culture, if you like. But to me, it was like, wow, this is DJs acting as a collective group, and understanding that in a way they were providing this incredible service to the record companies. They were making the record companies millions, and they were having to go and buy their vinyl, even though they had insecure jobs that weren't paid very well for the most part. And David saw, because of David's sensibility, we could call it his politics, if you like. He thought this was an injustice. He thought it was exploitation, and he hated exploitation. He hated violence, including economic violence, and he felt that the DJs needed to be better treated. So he had this space in Prince Street. He had kind of a few floors. He had made this move when the Loft on 647 Broadway was forced to close down in the summer of 1974. It's a whole story. We don't have to get into that now. But he moved to Prince Street in Soho. So he went from NoHo to Soho, had this space, opened the New York Record Pool. In this first interview, he mentioned the New York Record Pool. I was like, oh yeah, that was the gallery.
That's the wrong one. Go ahead.
So the gallery was, but so it was just like, it was almost like wherever, and this is what Love Saves the Day became. It wasn't, it became, apart from anything else, I set out thinking this is going to be the intro chapter to the book on house music. And by the time I'd reached what was effectively page 500, I had got to 1979. And
so let me understand because the theory of this whole thing. So you sit down with Mancuso, he spurts out all the names of all the players. Steve D Aquisto, Michael Capello, Record Pool, because he was in part of it. Your phone rings that day around. Who were the people calling to do the interviews with you?
Oh, I can't remember all the names actually. But definitely Steve D Aquisto was one of them. And I'm trying to think who else. I don't know if it was Freddie Taylor, maybe, who's a sort of somewhat forgotten figure was one of the first people who would step in for David when he needed to take a break at Prince Street in particular, because the parties at Prince Street started going for a very long time. They would start at midnight, and at one point they were going on until 8 o'clock the next evening. And David kind of, he wouldn't see daylight for the whole day. So I think it may have been Freddie Taylor. Sorry, I could go and check my notes, but that's too long ago to remember all of this. But definitely Steve, because then quite a number of my early interviews with David were joined by Steve would come along, and Steve was another larger than life figure, and he was quite a dominant. He was full of ideas. He had lots of memories, lots of ideas. He was quite a dominant figure, actually. And David they got to be a point where Steve was doing a lot of the talking. So there was some tension. They loved each other, David and Steve, but there was some tension between them as well at points.
Sure,
it's a tension that goes back to the record pool. There was even one interview in which, because it's there in Love Saves the Day. Steve D Aquisto basically went to a record store with one of these promotional records. And David wanted to be very strict about this. He said, in order to get the trust of the record companies, we have to be very clear that we don't try and resell these promotional records to the record stores to make money, because that will upset the record companies and they'll stop giving us promotional records. There were other things that the record pool insisted on doing, but this was one of the hallowed rules, if you like. And on one occasion, Steve D Aquisto went and took a record, a bunch of records that, according, as far as Steve was concerned, it was a record that it wasn't a very good record. They had been given tons of them at the record pool. They just didn't know what to even do with them. They were supposed to be a prize for a dance competition. I don't even remember exactly the details. But, Steve just did the naughty thing basically and went to a record company. This got back to David, and they had a certain blowout at that particular moment. Steve actually backed away from the Loft for a few years, but then reunited with David, and they became very close again. But somehow or other, this must have been either 1997 or 1998. They rehearsed this argument in front of me for an hour, and it was ferocious. It was like there was no let up in the passion. It was extraordinary.
So Steve, because I figured Steve had a big hand in this, because I remember when I was speaking to him, his knowledge of everything and his memory bank was locked in to everything going on around at that time. Yeah. But the question I get from a lot of people, because of Francis Grasso, and you wrote about that as well, being the first guy to work. Who gave you the information? Right, to blend, as they called
With
it.
Steve was in touch with France. Steve was based in Brooklyn, and he knew Michael Capello. They were best mates.
Michael Capello.
There's Michael. Hello, Michael.
Yeah, from New York, from wearing Abbott's pictures, right, from Les Jardins.
Yeah,
so Steve was friends with Michael.
Steve was still in touch with Michael. I think they definitely drifted. Michael had completely left the scene around about 1980. He'd ended up going to get a job in Germany after kind of when Disco Sucks kind of kicked in. He stayed in Germany, as far as I can remember, for maybe a year or two. And then he came back, and that was that. And he went into, as far as I can remember, at least the time I met him, he was in construction. I really like Michael, and I just had people, everyone I spoke to loved Michael. Nicky Siano loved Michael. Lisa Hazel loved Michael. Steve loved Michael. I mean, he was good looking, he was charming, and he was sweet. Michael wasn't ambitious. There were some people in the scene, probably Steve was one of them, who had a certain sort of ambition. They had a certain drive, and they wanted to have a certain kind. They craved a certain kind of recognition. But I don't think Michael was that person. Michael just had a gift and a feel, and he loved the pleasurable aspects of it. He enjoyed doing all the things that guys and women were doing back then, staying up all night, taking whatever they wanted to take, loving the music. And Michael was a very, very gifted, instinctive DJ. He had a feel. It was a lot of what was going on back then was about feel. And Michael had that feel as much as anyone. There's no question. So Steve introduced me to Michael, and Steve introduced me to Francis. I don't know. They weren't really particularly in touch with each other. They certainly weren't hanging out. I mean, you've got to remember, this is 1997, and they probably hadn't seen each other for years and years and years. But he was able to track down Francis, and I was particularly touched to be able to meet with Francis. I really love Francis.
What was that like? Meeting?
It was Francis was just the sweetest guy. I think he died. I forget the exact. We could look it up quickly but I don't want to interrupt the conversation. But it was before the book came out. Francis Grasso passed away, which was a big regret. I'm 98% sure of this. My memory sometimes plays tricks with me. But Francis, I would say he was struggling at that point in his life. He was drinking during the day. I mean, he's probably not the only person to do that. But I mean, he died quite soon after. So he was, he looked like a bit of a battered human being, but he spoke with a passion and a singularity that was remarkable, really. And I loved. He also wanted to tell his story. I think that to a certain extent, this guy called Albert Goldman, who was quite a well-known journalist in the late 1960s and 1970s, had written this book called Disco that I think came out maybe in 1978, maybe in 1979. And it was really a book about Studio 54. But he did interview Francis, and there was some detail about the backdrop of Francis in that book. So Francis but this book was long out of circulation. And, Francis, there was exactly the kind of person who, in the histories that were starting to come out at this moment, would get a 2-line reference as being the person who was an early DJ who had invented the beat mix kind of thing. I conducted several interviews with Francis. He was incredibly sweet. I don't know if it was maybe a year after I started to, had done these interviews with him, or maybe it was 9 months into it or something. Bill Brewster and Frank Broughton, who were beginning to write Last Night a DJ Saved My Life, approached him, and they wanted to interview him. And he actually didn't want to do the interview with them. I'm not saying this in the least bit against Bill and Frank, of course.
Good guys.
But Francis just wanted he felt that we had a deep engagement, that I was, and we developed a kind of an understanding, if you like, a rapport. And he just felt he wanted me to tell his story, and he didn't want anyone else to do it. Eventually Bill and Frank kind of knocked on his door sort of thing. And he did some sort of interview with them. I think he was a bit startled, really. I think Last Night a DJ Saved My Life is a really valuable book. It makes a really important, it covers a lot of ground. But the photo that they ran of Francis, I'm bound to say, I thought that was unfortunate. It was like Francis was looking not too good. He was startled. And it was like the caption was something like, this is what like years of DJing does to you or something, like you've got this kind of, you look like you're suffered. I mean, Francis also, as I kind of recount in the book, in Love Saves the Day, I should say, he got beaten up by the mafia because the mafia were controlling a lot of the discotheques in the early 1970s, and Francis had gone to play for, I think it was a discotheque that was named after him, Cafe Francis. I think it was on that move he'd left a kind of mafia-run discotheque in order to do it, and he got beaten up as a result, and his nose was broken, and so he'd gone through some unpleasant stuff, and it was just it was obviously meant in a humorous way, this caption, but then I thought it was a bit unfortunate, and Francis died not that long afterwards, so. So yeah, that was but it was there was Francis, and he really engaged, and Michael clearly felt a bit funny about talking to me, and I've had several people afterwards, because for him this was something that he did I can't remember his exact age when he started DJing. He might have been 19. He might have been 18. He might have even been 17.
Probably 17.
And he did it for. He might have done it for 10 years, but then he left it behind. There's some people, maybe I think you might be in this camp, Lenny, and I'm beginning to think I'm in this camp as well. And David Mancuso was in this camp. That something, and we could name a whole load of people who are here, where something happens to you, and this ends up becoming an important part of your life, and you never really stop, one way or another. But there are other people for whom this is a phase of life. They get into it for a period, but then it stops having that resonance with them. They get into other stuff. Some people get into wine. Some people get into food. Some people just want to devote themselves, to get into watching TV or something. Something changes. That what it was that they enjoyed doing when they were younger, and he wasn't bothered. He didn't come across as being someone who had a particularly strong ego as such. And he wasn't too bothered about having his name in lights or being recognized for his contribution. I think he thought it was a fun thing that he took part in. And that, and it was good while it lasted, but he had moved on. And the other thing is, there's not everyone wants people to kind of start digging about what they were getting up to when they were kind of 21. The stories that get to be told. And Steve was very open about these stories. I think Michael was a little bit more guarded about these stories. Steve told me the first time that, he took over doing a DJ solo spot, stepping in, I think, for Francis Grasso. He took LSD before DJing, and then found he was kind of found it almost impossible to kind of carry out his duties as the DJ that night. And Francis came along and was like, "What the hell are you doing, taking acid before you make your DJing debut?" So Steve didn't mind everyone knowing this, but not everyone wants this kind of stuff in print. This much I know from all sorts of people. Other people, that was something to always. It's very important that everyone was comfortable with what appeared in the book about them. I didn't want to start. Look, you can't talk about this scene and pretend that there's no drugs and there's no sex. And yet at the same time, you don't want to start doing it as a kind of sensationalist expose, because it's about the dance floor, it's about the music, it's about the culture. And that's always got to be central. But you can't cut everything away from that. I love the stories about the DJs who would get together at 4:00 in the morning and go for breakfast, and what they would order and what cafe they would go to, because it was part of the culture. And it brought it to life. It became three-dimensional. This was a lifestyle. It was a new lifestyle that people were leading. I didn't want to cut all that out. I didn't want it to be a bare bones dry, well, the one DJ puts on a record and this is how they mix to another record. You have that information in there, but it's got to be about life, because this is about life. So yeah, but there's certain people who feel sensitive about certain things being said, and so you got to kind of walk that path. Then Michael just came across as being someone who was happy to collaborate, but he didn't want to be doing lots of interviews. It wasn't very important to him.
Well, you know what it is? There's people looking for him now for interviews because you know there's this romance to find certain people that are still alive, and I get constant questions from people asking me, "Is Michael Capello even alive?" I think I asked you the same question, and I was like, "Well, are you sure?" Because I know you have the pictures and you did all the research, and Steve, and I know Steve was very close to Michael. Or was it called Kippy?
A lot of them are past now. I mean, obviously Steve, even before the book came out, he died. He had a brain tumor and died. It was very quick. It was very tragic. I've had this with all three books. It was especially with the first, Love Saves the Day, and then the last one, Life and Death on the New York Dance Floor, which covered the next period, if you like, 80 to 83. And, you know, during that, I thought, oh, hello, I recognize
there's his books. Yeah, there's his books.
So, you know, I interviewed Mark Kamens, the Danceteria DJ, who's such a sweetheart, and a really key figure, and also an unrecognized figure in many ways. I mean, Mark would only normally get a mention as being a one-time boyfriend of Madonna. That's how most people would refer to Mark. But he was an incredible DJ with an incredible vision and heart, actually, and connection. I mean, everyone thought Danceteria was like a rock punk kind of club, but it was so much more complicated. That's what this last book is about. It explores all the connections that were actually happening between the post-disco dance scene, what I call the art punk scene or the post-punk scene, and then this emerging rap and hip-hop scene. And when I arrived in New York City in the 1990s, everyone assumed that these scenes were kind of at war with each other. You know, the punks and the dance people and the rap hip-hop people, they weren't having conversations. But that was because New York City had become a battleground from the election from the 1980s onwards. So that's another story, which maybe we won't get into. But the scenes had subdivided and had become antagonistic to each other. But really, if you dig into the 1980s, Mark Kamens wasn't just a punk rock DJ at all.
No, I know that.
He was tight with Larry Levan, and he would bring records to David Mancuso, and he was also into hip hop and rap. And so that was actually what New York. You know, there's three different books, but it's really one book, I always kind of think. And it's about New York. It's about the music and the dance floors and the DJs and the music that evolves in New York City in this time of incredible cultural expression and interaction. And it's no surprise that, in fact, you know, someone like Mark. Anyway, so Mark, they were having conversations with each other. And you look at the records of the early 80s. I know we're jumping forward a bit here. You look at a record like, I mean, the three that I always pick out are Dinosaur L, Arthur Russell's lineup. One of his lineups, Go Bang. Peach Boys, Don't Make Me Wait, which was the band Larry Levan was involved with Michael De Benedictus. Hi Larry, and Planet Rock, Africa Bambaataa, and Soul Sonic Force, and all three records, in ways that we won't have time to get into here, crossed over between these three scenes: the punk scene, the post-disco dance scene, the emergent rap hip-hop scene. There was all this interaction, and you could hear it in the music, and you could only write about this period properly if you saw the interconnectivity. But sometime down the line, the scenes went to war with each other. There's reasons for that. It's about AIDS, it's about the crack epidemic, it's about Reagan's government cutting welfare and, attacking African-American communities, and all sorts of things put these communities on the defensive. And they started to defend themselves. Instead of being open, because I can't get on the screen doing this, I'm spreading my arms. Whereas the 70s and the early 80s were a time of openness, and where all these conversations were starting and were being explored. Then, the city became a hostile terrain, property price inflation, Wall Street exploding, stockbrokers taking over. And that's what put people in a defensive position. And that's what led to the division of these scenes. And whether there's a reopening up, I think maybe there is to a certain extent now, as people's ears reopen. The internet's contributing to this in part. I don't know. But anyway, Mark was one of these figures. He passed away before the book Life and Death on the New York Dance Floor came out. Anita Sarko was an extraordinary DJ She was the, in a way, definitely the most radical DJ at the Mud Club, and maybe the most notorious, although she ended up playing Mondays and Tuesdays, i.e. the night when only the regular insiders would go, not when the big crowds would go. And Anita Sarko was kind of supposedly a punk DJ, but she was an extraordinarily eclectic DJ. And she had very interesting conversations with Larry Levan. And again, they're not supposed to be having. Africa Bambaataa was going to the Paradise Garage. Fat Five Freddy was going to the Paradise Garage. He took Keith Haring to the Paradise Garage, and Keith, of course, ended up. There was all these connections, though. But anyway, sorry, I'm getting carried away with.
No, you're right. No, but I'm glad you're mentioning that, because those interludes how the metamorphosis change in the garage because of those likes of coming in and changing.
But yeah, and look, Larry was into ESG, bands like ESG and stuff. And the ESG were coming out of 99 Records, and it was kind of part of this, post-punk scene. But Larry had the flavor for that kind of liquid. We know this, right? But, you couldn't read about that in the punk histories, and you couldn't read about that in the disco or house music histories. That's why this early 80s period, which hadn't been written about properly, was kind of so interesting to me. But the point is, it was Anita Sarko. She died by suicide. She had also fallen out of sync with the times. So it's heartbreaking when you write a book, you interview someone, you want to tell their story, and then you really want them to read this story.
Not around.
They needed the recognition was overdue, and if they didn't even make it, as happened with the case of the number of people to the publication, it's really, it's heartbreaking, but then at least their story is there. That's the main. At least these interviews were conducted, and these stories were told. As for Michael, we kind of already said this, but I've lost touch with him. He didn't obviously particularly want to stay in touch. I understand that, and I'm fine with that. I could try and dig out whatever phone number I had for him.
That's maybe. Michael Capello, everybody. That's the understanding.
Everyone. Also, Michael Capello was everyone kind of found him attractive, very attractive. He was a kind of, he was a bit of a icon, I think, physical icon. But it was also because of his sweetness, I think. It wasn't just because he was like...
Was he like that too when you sat and talked with him? Was he very,
He seemed quite shy. He seemed quite shy. He was older. He was an attractive man.
And he was
I think he must have. I'm just trying to think how old he might have been when I spoke. But he was probably in his late 50s. We all age a bit. It was really lovely meeting him, and he was humble. He was sweet. He was happy to talk, but he wasn't like Steve. Steve still had a hunger. And rewinding back to the beginning of this kind of, elongated, winding, story that we've been on for the last however many minutes, Steve was powerful figure, and I had to separate Steve and David basically in order to do proper interviews with them, because otherwise they would be either arguing or disagreeing, whatever it might. Sometimes these things can be productive, but sometimes they can be not so productive. And
so speaking from one journalist, because now I kind of consider myself a media mogul now because of this job that we've all.
You certainly are.
How do you verify what they're telling you?
Very good question. It's very hard. You try, it was useful. There were certain publications came out, which were useful. Melting Pot, which was a in-house magazine created by Bob Casey for I forget what the name of his organization was, but it was it emerged around just before or around the same time as the New York City Record Pool. He wanted it to be more of a serious professional organization. He was very friendly, got on board figures like Bobby Guttataro and Richard Kazar, who were very influential. Bobby.
That's Bobby DJ Guttataro.
So there were so many hot and on the ball, DJs. David Rodriguez.
He was in Melting Pot too. They were all a lot of these pictures were Melting Pot. Yeah,
I don't know, but I can't remember. David might well have been actually. I can't remember. I know that Bobby Guttataro and Richard Kazar were involved, but it kind of ended up imploding. Bob Casey, he was a kind of peer of Alex Rosner. He was setting up lots of sound systems. David Mancuso invited him to the Loft to get some tips. And Bob Casey took a look around and he said, actually, you should be giving me tips, not the other way around. I can't do better than what you've got here. David was already deep into developing a remarkable sound system. I'm losing my drift a bit, whatever it was we were
the verification process.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Sorry.
So no, that's great. Well remembered. So there were lots of. I'm just trying to remember why I started the kind of what had led me to talk about Richie Kazar and Bobby Guttadaro, but to make the point anyway is that. Oh, that's right, the publication. So Bob Casey had Melting Pot. Michael Gomes, who ended up becoming a very good friend of Francois Kevorkian and was a real fan of and very close with Nicky Siano, wrote this news sheet called Mixmaster, which was hilarious, witty, incisive, gossipy, and very interesting in terms of its analysis. It was like a remarkable kind of phenomenon. And so actually it was Francois who had a complete set of these, and Francois was kind enough to copy his set and give it to me at Michael Gomes's request. So these kind of things nail a few things down.
Okay, now it makes sense.
When Record World started to come out, Vince Alessi was invited to do the Disco Files column in Record World. I think that started in, am I right in remembering it's very late 1974, maybe it gets going, I think. So that would help. But this earlier period, the first 4 years of the decade, are very murky, really. There's not much to go on. And it's really about what I found myself doing was interviewing people relentlessly. I mean, I think it was probably 100 people for Love Saves the Day, but many of those people I interviewed several times because it was a matter of getting the story, comparing it with another story, working out where the inconsistencies were, going back, checking. I sort of remember that David didn't have a bunch of his kind of own dates in order. I think I can't remember the details necessarily, but he made a very significant trip to London in the summer of 1973. But I think maybe he was remembering it to be the summer of 1972. This can sound very pedantic, but when you then understand that the gallery had opened shortly before David made this trip as a straight version of the Loft. Not that the Loft was gay, by the way. The Loft was very, very mixed. And one of David's lines to me, which I've always thought was very important, is no one was checking your identity at the door. Early on, I kept asking David, was the Loft a black gay party? Was it black and gay? Was it a black gay party? And David said, like there were black people there, and there were gay men there, and there were black gay men there, but it was not a black gay party. All sorts of people would go there. Divine would go there. He would say, "How do you categorize her?" That was one of his lines. It's the point is David was interested in human beings, and he wanted human beings to dance together, whatever their background. His model, and he only came to understand this later, was his experience of growing up in the children's home, aged 2 days old. And that was a home for the dispossessed. It didn't matter who they were welcomed by these nuns, as it happens, and looked after. It didn't matter what their background was. And that was David's approach. This is a place of refuge where you can come and express yourself, relax, wherever you're coming from. This is a space where you can, enter into a different world that is tolerant, that is open, and is driven by music and dance. So David's like, no one is checking your identity at the door. And when the Paradise Garage ended up splitting a gay night and basically a mixed but de facto straight night around about 1980, David was very upset by this. Now, of course, there were plenty of people who didn't agree with David, and they said, look, black gay men in particular, who were the dominant group, and Latin gay men, who were the dominant group at the Paradise Garage on the Saturday night, they were outcasts in society, and they wanted to be able to have a place that they could call their own. And I can understand this, and plenty of people believe in this. And I would never want to be the person who says that shouldn't exist. Of course, if people gathering want to gather in that way, then that's important, and it becomes an important place of freedom and expression, and a home. But I also felt very drawn to David's utopian vision of everyone coming together under one space. So anyway, Nicky opened the gallery as a straight. He'd got kicked out of the Loft eventually because he was caught dealing drugs 3 times, and David's policy was, three times and you're kind of out or whatever. Nicky was vivacious and expressive and hungry and hilarious and obsessed with music and DJing. He'd already started to DJ in some public discotheques, and he wanted to start a party, and he kind of got some money together through, I think, a brother's friend. He was kind of partnered up with Robin Lord, who was a one-time kind of girlfriend for a little bit, but then they just became kind of best mates or something. Yeah, that's the gallery dance floor with blowing up balloons. I think Frankie Knuckles might be in one of these. I can't.
Yeah, the top part, in the top picture with the baseball cap.
So the gallery opened in the sometime around the spring of 1973, and it flopped. It completely flopped. It just wasn't working. But then David went away in the summer of 73 to Europe. That's when he actually picked up Barabbas, Woman, and Wild Safari at a flea market, I think in Amsterdam, from what I can remember. But he went to Europe for the summer, and the night before David went, the last party, I should say, before David went, Nicky was outside the front giving flyers saying, "You want to carry on the party? Come to the gallery next week." And all of a sudden, the gallery took off. Now, so whether David said he went, all of a sudden, David saying did he go to the New York City in the summer of 1972? To Europe in the summer of 1972, or the summer of 73. All of a sudden, that becomes really significant, because we can then know when the gallery opens, partly according to that, and be absolute. And we can also know about changes that happen in the Loft and its place in the world, because once David comes back, the gallery's exploded. What happens to David's crowd?
And look at Nicky now. He's at that point. He's Miss Liberty.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But that's what I'm saying.
Nicky was quite David was a bit of an introvert and Nicky was an extrovert.
Oh, totally opposites. They are totally opposites. Nicky's
they had the interesting conversation as well. So, and the other thing is, Frankie partly got his breakthrough by volunteering to blow up balloons at the gallery, and then introduced Larry Levan to the gallery. Oh, so these dates really matter. I mean, it's only a year, but whole kind of biographies and stories get built on these dates. And including also, the other thing is that it was a very significant year for David, because when David was in London, he told, and this is a kind of memory I think you can trust, he said, "I was reading a newspaper and I read about the collapse of the Broadway Central." And the Broadway Central was a hotel that was actually linked physically, as far as I can remember, to the Mercer Street Art Centre, which housed the kitchen. As it happens, an experimental music space where Arthur Russell became music director in 1970, can't quite remember, so 73 to 74, I think. So the Broadway Central was it was a kind of hotel complex that was linked to the Mercer Street Arts Centre and was around the corner, kind of backed onto, as far as I can remember, the 647 Broadway, where David was living. And it was when this hotel collapsed that summer, and David read about it in the newspaper while he was in London, and he thought, uh-oh. And indeed, it's a hugely significant moment, because after that, the inspectors started to swarm around the whole area, because I think, it had been a big tragedy, and maybe a handful of people had died as well. Certainly lots of injuries and major concerns. And the inspectors started to look at internal kind of construction changes that had been carried out without permission, because that was why the Broadway Central had collapsed. And David had undertaken some changes that he always maintained to me were not structural, and that they were safe in order to expand into the next apartment. He'd basically broken through some historic arches that had been filled out. So he said they were safe, but the inspectors were all of a sudden onto him. And it was a year later, basically, that the Loft was closed because of the rate of this inspection. So this is a bit.
No, it's right. No, but you know what?
At that point, I knew if I can find that newspaper article in the New York Times that is reporting on the Broadway Central collapsing, we know that was the summer that David was in London, and we know that was when the gallery exploded, and we know that that's when Frankie Knuckles and Larry Levan started entering into the scene, and not before. because I think Frankie in our interview had told me that he basically started maybe the first interview, he started DJing in 1971 or 72. And I was like, that sounds early to me, but let me try and check and try and so it was all about these different stories. And it's not that Frankie was being dishonest. It's just that people were being asked about stuff that they hadn't really been asked about many times before. And in some cases hadn't been asked about at all. So it was about comparing and contrasting and just finding, just like cohering stories and going back to people and saying, well, I've just spoken to this person and they say this and that says that. So I think this means that you did that, and trying to basically get consent. And the other thing is just working out who are the people who are driven by a belief in what the scene offered, and the way in which it offered to transform people's lives in a meaningful way through music and dance, because that's what they wanted to do. They wanted this group of DJ. The DJs obviously emerged as the heroes of the book. They wanted to change the world, for the better. They wanted music to become better. They wanted sound systems to become better. They wanted people to have more opportunity to dance, to experience life, in a pleasurable way. And so it's working out who was in it from that point of view, and who was in it maybe, I don't want to say in a more cynical way, but someone who was maybe, was more prone to exaggerating their contribution. And just through interviews, you sometimes get a feel of that. And
that's something we will find, that, sometimes people will change it, or what I call rewash history. So it's
maybe misremember.
Well, for a cleaner outcome, let's put it like that, because some of these outcomes are not as pretty as they like us to believe they are.
Yeah.
And I've been in my own document, between verifying my own things and talking to others, and sometimes you start to hear the same story different than what you've gotten. Starts to make you lend that minute.
Yeah, exactly. So you're here as well.
Yeah, exactly.
So you're involved in the same sort of process, I guess.
You're doing a great job, though. I'm just happy to hear that you were able to get all this down before the key people were gone.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it was I haven't said this yet, but it just felt like I was so fortunate, to be meeting.
But yet, I want to say this to you, but yet you were hating on it at first. It's wonderful. That's why I'm sitting here going, man, you're hating on this, but yet you're writing something that's so biblical that never was ever explained nor ever written like this. Well, pieces were like Melting Pot and other stuff, trade magazines, but nothing that was of substantiability of this, guys. Nothing like this exists.
Thank you. You don't have to. You're being very kind. And, but I really just felt in a genuine way that I was just surprised that I felt like, who am I to be writing this history? I hadn't lived in New York. I hadn't gone to the Loft in 1970. I hadn't gone to the Loft in 1982. I hadn't gone to the Paradise Garage. I came to live in New York in 1994. But in the end, I had some people sort of criticize me. I didn't really. Yeah,
what was some of the criticism?
I didn't really. I accept all sorts of criticism, actually, and we don't really have that much time left. But criticism is fine. Constructive criticism. Of course, we've all got things that we can continually learn. We should never get too settled in who we are or what we're saying. So that's all good. But some people said, "How can you write about this culture when you weren't there?" And I was there. And some people say I was there, and I'm not going to read this book. But what I did genuinely find is that, number one, it became an active advantage that I wasn't there and that I wasn't from New York, because I didn't walk into this with a prior allegiance saying, yeah, I was going out to this place, therefore I'm not being critical of Mel's book, for example, at all. But Mel had his allegiances, clearly. He had his interests, and it's an autobiography. It's not a historical account of what happened.
100%.
His story.
Very well said.
And it's great for being that story. But it's not a historical account of the scene, because Mel was in that scene, and he had Mel did not like David. he really didn't want to talk about David. They had an argument. I think it was around, I mean, it may have been before, but certainly around the time of Larry Levan's death. And it left Mel very, very unhappy. And these kind of, look, when I was going around, there was lots of what we would say in the Jewish community, broigus. People were upset with each other. There'd been arguments and people had been hurt. And a lot of people hadn't got over this. And the shit happens, people fall out. It's a passionate culture. And, you know, people with passion comes energy, and sometimes that is positive and sometimes it can lead to fallings out. So this happens, but it was an advantage for me. And it's an advantage for to be seen as someone who didn't have all these prior allegiances and could come and tell, you know, people would tell me their stories and I would do my honest best to find a way. I had a bunch of guys who we could sort of say came from the white gay scene, which kind of found its main expression first on Fire Island, Ice Palace and Sandpiper, then at the 10th Floor, then at Flamingo, then at 12 West, and latterly at the Saint, but that came out in 1980 and was a bit outside of the scope of Love Saves the Day, though I write about it in the last book. And they really, and I had a few people, that's Flamingo, yeah, that's a lovely picture.
Flamingo.
Turntables. I got a colour slide of that, so it's a shame it's in black and white, but there you go. Michael Fesco was another real sweetheart, by the way, the guy who opened Flamingo and also ran the Ice Palace. But there was a few guys from the white gay scene, if I can call it that, who said, hang on a second, David Mancuso didn't invent, for want of a better term, disco, or wasn't the first. We were. And I did my research and I concluded that if you want to go back in time, at the very beginning of, and by the way, the key thing for me in this culture is not discotheque. Discotheque culture goes back to the early 60s and before. So, I just see my charger hasn't been in and I'm suddenly on a low battery. I don't want this to end.
Boy.
So let me plug myself in quickly.
But we'll wrap this up because you get into the point.
Yeah, I did my look. The culture starts for me when the DJ begins to respond to the dancing crowd. And there were plenty of DJs in the 1960s, but they did not enter into a conversation with the crowd. And the first, David never liked being called a DJ, but if we use this for shorthand, the first DJs who responded dynamically and entered into a conversation with the dancers, the first ones to do it were Francis Grasso and David Mancuso. And I cannot be absolutely sure when Francis Grasso, he was at the Sanctuary already, but the key change was when the Sanctuary, Seymour and Shelley, who ran gay bars in the West Village, bought the Sanctuary and were the first owners of a public discotheque to admit LGBT dancers into a public discotheque. And they did this sometime towards the beginning of 1970. I know that on New Year's Eve, Francis remembered that on New Year's Eve, it was still in the hands of the Sanctuary, was still in the hands of the previous owner. So David, we know the first proper party that became known as the Loft somewhat later was 14th of February, 1970. That was a Saturday night. It was a Valentine's Day party. We know that was, whether the Sanctuary was that same week, 2 weeks, it doesn't really matter. But this was the argument of the book. I don't think it quite been made before. You know, Bill Brewster and Frank Brownson, their book is much more of a wide span of the history of DJ culture. And they begin with Jimmy Savile, a radio DJ primarily in the UK, who then became later disgraced as a serial child abuser.
That's sad.
Shameful story. But this is a different book that serves the purpose of a much more meta overview of all the different, hip hop, everything is in there. And it does a very good job of that. My point was like, where did this culture begin? And it was about this communication. And so I would go back to these guys who would email me afterwards and say, well, we started it. And I'd say, well, I did my research. And if you can point to the point where there's a white gay private party or a discotheque that is doing this, because the Sanctuary was not a white gay space, it was very mixed as well. Then show me. This is the best I've been able to do. And so being the outsider was enabled me to kind of. I had other people say, look,
and be bipartisan by that means. So you had no preconceived notions.
No,
you didn't go in going, I know better than you. You just said, show me the history. Basically, let's see it.
Yeah.
Beautifully done.
So, and then of course, then I got involved with all these people, and I sort of, I was no longer completely the outsider. I developed what you might call friendships. I also had to be careful to retain a sense of autonomy in my writing. I didn't want to do any PR writing. And I never did. I felt that what I wrote, was what I wanted to write. I didn't want to put in stuff that people felt was very private. I didn't want to put in stuff that was inaccurate, but otherwise I wanted that history to tell it as best as I could work out. So, and the other thing to say is, like, this is the work of history. Historians do not have to experience the history they write about. If they did, we would never have any bloody history books. Historians go and they make the use of surviving evidence, whether it's through people who are still alive, or it's archival, or it's archaeological, or whatever it might be, and you bring together the information and try and make the best of it. And we need to know about our history, because that's where we come from, and it informs us today, and it also provides us with our context. Because we now know about what happened in the 1970s, we hold on to a vision of what still has to be possible today, because it's happened once. Doesn't mean clearly we can't wind the clock back. We can't go back in time as such. But if things have happened once, it means that they can happen again. We can have parties that, are organized in a certain way. If we want to have a party with balloons on the ceiling, we can do that. Okay. If we want to have a party that runs itself according to an invite list, even if it's a democratic invite list. So, it's just about, one thing I do believe is that New York was a very democratic city in the 1970s and early 1980s. It was cheap. It was multi-ethnic, it was cross-class, it was heaving with a sense of community, property prices were cheap, and there was an awful lot of good music was recorded and came out of New York City during this period.
Big time.
It was an extraordinary period, and it's I went there. This is the other thing I suppose I would say is, like, I went there kicking and screaming. I wanted to write that house music book. I wasn't interested in the 1970s officially. So, I came from being an extreme skeptic to being a convert, if you like. And of course, the one thing I haven't said is all this extraordinary music was introduced to me that was recorded during the 1970s that I now, of course, love. It's not that I also love electronic music still. I'm getting more and more into soul music from the 60s, whatever. It's like the world of music is rich and diverse. I'm getting much more into African and Latin music these last 5 years, maybe.
Right.
But I still love house music.
Sure.
But it's the world is wide and rich, and let's embrace it. And
let's embrace this too, because we want people to keep following you. Make sure you get his other books, Life and Death on the New York Dance Floor, a Tim Lawrence publication book, another one he wrote. And of course, Arthur Russell, those that don't know, I Want to Go Bang, and all those great records.
Is it all over my face?
It's all over my face too. Another great
And
record.
Arthur would take his music down to the Loft and listen to it on David's system, because David had the nicest stereo system.
Yeah, right, in the town.
Yeah.
And we can't thank you enough, Tim. I know we're at 9:00 in the UK and you must run.
I've got to go and see a venue. I've got to go and see a new venue. Looking for a new venue for parties. So the work. This wasn't work. This was pleasure. But
we enjoyed you. We enjoyed your whole synopsis, and we actually got some snapshots into your world of what it was like dealing through the one book. You were able to explain a lot.
Yeah, it's good. It's great. Almost never do interviews like this about, like, how did how did it all happen? This book. So, like, the details. It's been really fun revisiting that whole process, because it was as I say, I felt very lucky. I felt like amazed that this hadn't been done by someone else. But grateful to just meet these people, hear their stories, and then shape them in a way and give them a context and a narrative that hopefully gave them some profile that they didn't quite have previously, and a sense of meaning. That's what it all comes down to. That meaning that I got on that dance floor after my parents died, and I felt like, yes, here, this is a world which is a world that gives me a sense of sustenance. And I think this is what we all, that's at the core of it, surely. This kind of experience that the dance floor can give us.
Well,
if it's not that, then it's something else.
It's methodical. It's methodical. It's like a drug in a good way. It heals. Music heals in many different ways. And that's why
community as well.
Community, and that's why Garage worked, and that's why later on Sound Factory worked, and that's why Twilo, Ministry, that's why people come together, not just to pick up each other, but also the music does something. It's infectious. That's why we're all in this. Absolutely. The music does it every time. Again, we can't thank you enough, and God bless you, and good luck to everything.
Thank you for being so generous, and for all your time, and for showing some interest. And it's been really, really fun. I've enjoyed it a great deal. So good luck with the rest. Good luck with all your future interviews. It's
you too.
Fantastic what you're doing.
If you ever write the house music book, you know you gotta ask me to be that book, because
I'm still being asked. One day. The next book is going to be something else, it turns out, but maybe the one after that. Okay.
So before I let you go, thank you. Before I let you go, let me just say this, because next week we have Godfather of House, UK House, Jazzy M coming on. He's going to tell his story, and his story goes back, way back into time. He is also another architect to this whole dance music thing, and we are so excited to have him as well. We can't thank you enough, Mr. Tim Lawrence, the philosopher, the go-to, our man for dance music. We check you. You doing it each and every time. Good luck on your
and I have to shout out to you though. When the number of your great records I've danced to, it's been it's so good to be able to spend some time with you as well. So thank you not only for the interview, but the amazing music over such a long period of time.
Thank you, and thank you for being a huge supporter to what I do. Without all, I always say, without all of you, there is no me. And on that note,
that's the same for all of that's the same. We all are interconnected.
That's right. Without all of you at home watching all of us, there would be no True House Stories, and no reason for Mr. Tim Lawrence to tell that story. So on that note, I want to wish everyone a good night, and ta-ta for now. See you all next week.